My speech today, my little presentation, is going to be in two parts. First, it's going to be some pretty pictures, which you can see up on the screen there. Look highly complicated, designed to impress you that I know a great deal about the nature of what drives the economy. Truth is, most economists don't know a great deal about drives the economy, therefore they want to put nice, specific little boxes up there in front of you, leave the right impression. My second part is going to be what we can do about the sorts of issues that affect productivity at the national level. So Kerry is doing productivity at the firm level, and productivity at the firm level is frankly far more predictable than productivity at the national level. So the first thing to pay attention to with these boxes, and I apologise to those of you who've seen these before, although I have changed the colours today, just in case you have seen these before to make it look impressive, because I've been using this kind of thematic for 2 years now and it seems to be quite widespread. So moving from the left to the right, that is the driver of national income in Australia. Those are the drivers of national income in Australia since the 1960s. So 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. The blue box, the bright blue box, is productivity. So when people say productivity is the primary driver of national income, you can see it up there in front of you. Now the red and the yellow, we can sort of ignore those, although I can tell you what they are for people in Q&A who are really interested in it. The most impressive thing about this is the grey boxes. Now the grey box, and you'll see that in the decade, the 2000s, that's the terms of trade. So that's the driver otherwise in the 2000s that gave us decent national income growth. And you can see from that black line, if you follow the black line across, that aside from the spectacular period in the 60s, pretty much expectations-wise, notwithstanding recessions, notwithstanding a lot of variations, notwithstanding technology shifts, notwithstanding women returning to the workforce in the 80s, which is the red, notwithstanding all those things, national income growth has been about 2%, roughly speaking, decade after decade, notwithstanding all that variation. If you then move to the far right-hand side and look at the two boxes on the far right-hand side, you'll see the black line starts to dip. Now that's the outlook for national income growth, that black line. It's going to be about half of what it's been in the past if we persist with the productivity growth that we have experienced in the 2000s. So you'll see that that blue box in the 2000s, it's just carried on across to the far right-hand box. And the box in between that is the performance of the last 10 years, 2004 to 2014. So some people have said productivity has recovered recently. This is labour productivity, has recovered recently. And they've comforted themselves that therefore we're probably okay again now on this productivity story. So there it is in the last decade, including the last 4 years. It's not actually a very good performance. Now, you could say, aha, but you've cunningly put all the worst years of the 2000s in that last, it's 2004 to 14, you've cunningly done that. Well, possibly it wasn't cunning, it was just the last 10 years. But anyway, so then I'll show you now. So this is the same set of boxes. Blue is still productivity. Everything else has been collapsed into red, just for simplicity purposes. But again, go to that second last box on the right-hand side. So that's productivity in the last 4 years. Now, it's a bit misleading. You know, people will tell you productivity over 1 year, not actually a terribly great story to rely upon for policy purposes. Even 4 years, perhaps it's not a really great story. A decade long, that's getting to be a reasonably reliable story. So you'll see the last 4 years, yep, labour productivity has moved up a bit. Certainly better than the period of the 2000s. Bottom line is, though, national income is still dipping. And the outlook for 2012-13 through to 2024-25, which is the far right-hand box, is still for a constant and continuous decline. And that's what we have to do if we're to lift the black line back up again. We have to, that yellow additional amount of space is how much productivity has to jump up in the period 12-13 through to 24-25 if we're to keep national income growth at about 2%. And if you then aggregate the yellow and the blue box on that far right-hand side, then move your eye back across towards the left, you'll find that we don't have a decade like that, actually. We got the 1960s. A lot of big technology improvements in the 1960s. A lot of capital deepening into labour. But we've never really had a performance like that. Even the 1990s, the celebrated 1990s, not quite as good a performance as we would need to do in the coming 10 years. It does say we're going to have to do something quite spectacular on productivity in this current period, right around now, and through for the next 5 or 6 years if we're to see national income growth improve. Now, it's also suggested that aggregates like this, national income growth, don't really matter a lot to individuals. You know, how many people really believe that their income is driven by an aggregate like this? In a minute, I will get on to show you some individuals, stories in relation to individuals. Meantime, however, I'm going to drop down to sectors. So this shows you manufacturing, transport, electricity, gas, water, and mining. And this is the last decade. And the blue line is the capital investment that's been undertaken by each of those sectors in the last decade. And the green line is the output benefit that they got. Doesn't look real good, does it? So if you're a big investor in any of those sectors in the last 10 years, your returns haven't been that great. Now, you will see output lifting up in mining a bit. And people have comforted themselves that, again, all that unrequited investment, as we like to call it, in mining, that's skewed to the long term, will actually improve performance over time. It is lifting up. Story in the other sectors wouldn't lead you to heavily invest in those sectors right now, I wouldn't have thought. And you know there's a lot of interest in why we aren't getting an investment response to cheap debt. That'll be a contributing factor. And this is the productivity performance in those same sectors. And you'll see mining productivity, it's lifted a bit. Labour productivity being the blue lines, you'll see it's lifted a bit from a very, very poor performance. But over the period that we're recording here, you know, it's only manufacturing has sustainably improved its productivity throughout that period. You know, finance and insurance services, we're going to publish in about a week or two on finance and insurance services an analysis of this, and you'll find that the story in finance and insurance is actually exceptionally complicated. And of course, everything's exceptionally complicated, but nevertheless, it is really complicated. About 40-odd% of the value effect alone in finance and insurance is entirely driven by shifts in interest rates. So it's not actually a variation in product, it's just a variation in the price of the product. So, you know, the complications like that. So I particularly look at things and say, so mining, if we have been comforting ourselves that mining's going to, you know, somehow improve, no, mining's, you know, a bit of a positive show, but really not that good. Utilities, still not that good. But even relying on those two things together, that slide and this slide, you wouldn't actually say the story's really looking very good from either productivity or the output return performance. So I said I would tell you a little bit about returns to individuals. And so I'm going to put up two slides here. One is wages, as in the real wage rate per hour by comparison with real GDP per hour. And then I'm going to do an international one, which is this next one here. So I'll do domestic first. And moreover, they're quite different. What they're measuring here is quite different. So you'll see that wage rates have not matched GDP growth through the 2000s. Now, that's a bit contrary to people's general impression. You know, wages have really boomed. The bottom line is this is a values-based. This is worth dollars here, right? And what it means is, yeah, wages went up quite a lot, but returns to capital went up even more. And that's the exchange rate effect and a whole bunch of other things in the 2000s. But the bottom line is, so there's a set of statistics which say, gee, people might want to expect to see their wage returns improve in the coming decade. Here's the alternative story. Real wages in Australia, which is the blue line, versus, and again, the period's roughly from the start of the 2000s onwards where the deviation starts to occur, versus productivity in Australia. And you'll see real wages outstrip productivity quite significantly in that decade. Now, these are indexes, these are growth rates, right? And the other one it gives you a sort of value impact. So there's two different stories in wages, two different stories for individuals. But none of the preceding story at a sector level would suggest to you, I think quite rationally, that wages should expect any better returns in the coming decade. There's no story in there which says I'm going to invest more because, for a start, productivity hasn't been that good and output returns haven't been that good in terms of the historical period if you're a business looking backwards, and you're not going to have strong incentives out of that unless something else changes to invest more heavily and therefore provide some potential scope for wages to rise. And particularly if that relativity between productivity and wages persists like that, you're not going to get, I think, a really good outlook. So again, you know, everything suggests to me that from a national economy level versus what individual firms can do for their productivity, from a national economy level, we need an improving story. And just in case you thought somewhere offshore there's a better story, I always like to put up the conference board slide here. You will have seen this in a couple of publications. I'm quite attached to what the conference board does in the US. This is an international comparison of, I guess, what you might call the economist's preferred measure of productivity. So this is multi-factor productivity or total factor productivity, not labour productivity. And the red boxes are declines in productivity. And although it's a complicated looking slide, let me tell you that across the developed world, the story through the 2000s is the return that we have got from total factor productivity has generally been 0 to negative, persistently across the developed world. So everybody appears to be suffering a secular decline in productivity. This too is not a really great outlook for a circumstance in which you might expect, individuals to get better returns for their labour or indeed for their capital investments. Not a good outlook at all. So the story on productivity, you've generally heard the term, it's pretty crook. Well, my contention is most of the stats do support the fact that the story is pretty crook. So what can we do about this? It's all very well me coming along saying things are crook in Tullarook. What can we do about this? I have 3 things to suggest today, and I don't know who's been speaking prior to me on different, so I'm sorry if I elaborate on ground that others have already taken up, but first, in my view, the Harper Reform package must be taken seriously by the states and the Commonwealth, acting together in the same way as the Helmer process required of those very same institutions a generation ago. There is currently no evidence to suggest that they are going to take it seriously, which is a genuine pity. Speaking personally, I'm far less concerned about how far each of the individual reforms in the Harper package are taken, as I am concerned that the states and the Commonwealth act together and that they take seriously their responsibility to address these kinds of reforms at the national level, facing the kind of outlook that I've articulated in these earlier pictures. The benefit lies as much in the display of joint will as it does in the contents of the reform. And it does that because it alters expectations across the economy. In my view, that was a primary driver of why productivity did lift in the 1990s. It wasn't just that firms were exposed to wider competition and that workplaces were able to take advantage of enterprise bargaining and things like that. It wasn't just those factors. It was that expectations shifted, that we are all going to have to adjust, or only some of us will benefit and quite a few of us will not. Perhaps the suggestions made by the Premier of South Australia in the last 24 hours offer a way to link the Harper productivity-enhancing reforms with revenue-based improvements and their aspirations of the states. Second, we need to address the social service delivery sector with an intent that goes beyond simply addressing fiscal burdens. We face a problem in the social services sector of both higher expectations around quality of services and an older Australia. These will drive up the fiscal burdens, but they're not the primary problem. The primary problem is that these services are still delivered mostly by the public sector, and where the private sector is involved in delivering them, the public sector is still a paymaster, still sets the terms by which those services are delivered. We haven't really done anything about addressing productivity in the public sector. And it's hard to measure in the private sector, well, it's even harder to measure in the public sector. Nevertheless, the Productivity Commission, we recently published a study of healthcare reforms available within the current system. That is, without breaking the system, without moving to radical change, healthcare reforms and the benefits available from them within the current system. And those were very, very significant numbers, and I commend that piece of work we published about 2 months ago to your examination. The driver, though, the problem in social policy reform is the vexed question of who in a shared system owns the problem. This again tends to suggest that the Commonwealth and the states will have to work together to get effective reform. And the third area is infrastructure. The Governor of the Reserve Bank recently spoke, and his deputies have spoken before, about how we can and should improve productivity with well-chosen infrastructure investment. He said, "The impediments are in our decision-making processes and, it seems, in our inability to find political agreement on how to proceed." This is pretty much what our infrastructure report to governments last year said. Get the selection process right. Engage with those who must pay. Hey, let's treat them like consumers. You heard Kerry talking about treating customers appropriately. Let's treat them like consumers and provide them with information accordingly on what the allocation objectives actually are. Make the case why the mega project must be preferred, apparently, to the higher return local project. And all of this is most obvious in roads investment, the last redoubt of the unreformed investment planning process. It's been deeply disappointing to see so little effort made in the area of road reform. Instead, today, the focus is on the price of cheap debt. You know, interest rates are down, let's borrow and invest in infrastructure. It will not work effectively to be productivity enhancing until you get the selection process right for the projects. Ignore that basic test and you're halfway to building the bridge to nowhere. And there's no productivity gain from building the bridge to nowhere. We lack quite a lot of desirable infrastructure, particularly in transport in this country. But if we won't get the planning right, if we won't use the pricing of debt appropriately, we won't use project selection appropriately, we will have no capacity to invest on a sustainable basis. Thank you very much.